strong with number 10, bloodletting. How about when they used to use leeches for everything? You know? Got a sore arm? Leeches. Sexually repressed? Leeches. Already bleeding? Leeches. You know? Obviously in the pursuit of better medicine we have had to get over some growing pains, but sometimes I find out things on this channel that I really wish I didn't need to know. In the 1800s, the French went through 40 million leeches in a year. But they weren't just applied to our legs and forearms, no. For more delicate places they would attach the leech to fishing line and then lower it down a person's throat or put it up where the sun don't shine. Yeah. According to a Handbook of Uterine Therapeutics and Diseases of Women, 1868, leeches were applied to their sensitive areas in order to relieve uterine disease, sexual excitement, and exasperation. In fact, the British gentry had their wives leeched every 2 weeks, and sometimes the leech would get lost up there. Don't worry, it would make its way out eventually. But also, doctors still use leeches to this day, but for actual scientific research due to the anticoagulant qualities. So that's kind of cool, but still, for everything, really? Number 9, they don't know everything. This isn't to add skepticism to seeking medical advice when you need it, especially after this year. Doctors have busted their butts and saved lives every single day, but they are human and they can't know everything, and a good doctor will admit that to you. But if you meet one who claims that they do know everything, run for the hills. Their arrogance could cost you your life. Jayan Patel, also known as Dr. Death, was one such doctor and surgeon who worked in Australia and the USA. Due to his incompetence and lack of knowledge, Patel is suspected of being responsible for over 87 deaths. He would often perform surgeries that weren't his responsibility, resulting in serious injuries and death. He once even performed a colonoscopy backwards. He forged operating theater reports, and while working in the US was accused of the crimes he would later be convicted of in Australia. He never asked for a second opinion, knowing full well the surgeries were not necessary. This man was so eager to reach for the knife that he disregarded his patient's welfare again and again. He was finally sentenced to 7 years in prison, though he was released on parole after only 3.5. But the second aspect of this case that has doctors hesitant to bring him up is the fact that the administration let him in with the dodgy credentials he had. Like, he was already accused of these misdemeanors before he was hired in Australia. This man also taints the spirit of healthcare workers, but he serves as a good reminder to always get a second opinion. Number 8, John Hunter. John Hunter was one of the most progressive surgeons in the UK during the course of the 18th century. He was hands-on and dissected thousands of cadavers in his attempt to understand human anatomy. Due to his studies, groundbreaking and at times shocking surgical practices were introduced to the field, saving many lives. He was even made surgeon to the king, and after his death, his specimens became part of a museum. But there are some things people don't like to mention about this guy, which include the amount of grave robbing he did. Ever heard of Jekyll and Hyde? Well, this man was the inspiration for him. Hunter often paid resurrectionists, like a fancy name for grave robbers, to dig up and bring corpses to the back of his apartment. But he even tried to take things while people were still alive, such as the case of Joseph Haydn, and I quote, "A few days prior to my departure, Mr. Hunter asked me to visit him due to some urgent circumstances. I went there. After the opening compliments, some robust fellows entered the room, seized me, and tried to force me on a chair. I yelled, punched, and trampled with my feet until I managed to free myself. Mr. Hunter was already on standby with his surgical tools." Unquote. Anything for the cause, eh, Mr. Hunter? Number 7, Midnight Climax. This CIA project involved doctors, scientists, but not a whole lot of ethics, which definitely goes against the Hippocratic Oath. Mind control would be a terrifying thing to have over somebody else, but super useful for all things intelligence related, which is exactly why during the 1950s the CIA started the Midnight Climax project. It was a mind control research project whose aim was to investigate the effects of psychedelics like LSD. Could they be used for mind control? The thing is, their subjects didn't consent to being their puppets. In San Francisco and New York City, the CIA paid to lure patients to warehouses where they would secretly dose them with LSD. They would then monitor them through a one-way glass to see if they got whatever the results they were looking for were. I guess they didn't, because by 1965 the safe houses were shut down when the project was discovered. Essentially, the mind control investigation turned into a research project into extensive sexual blackmail, surveillance tech, and how mind-altering drugs were used on field operatives. Number 6. Counter irritation. This one, man, this one's so stupid. Look, I get, like, I know I'm a 21st century woman looking back and judging the past, and I'm not a doctor, but who was the person who had the gall to make up a treatment, because they definitely made it up, and convinced themselves and several doctors that it worked? Is that the kind of confidence we all need? Like, just do it? Like, I don't know. Counter irritation was a treatment that literally makes no sense at all and didn't do anything good, but people believed it worked. It was a remedy that required irritation of the skin to counter a deeper issue. Using a scalpel, they would make a gash and just stick like dried peas and beans in it to promote infection. Then they would reopen it every day so it wouldn't heal. They would also use a caustic solution or hot iron to cause blisters that could only be like a centimeter wide. Some doctors, like the senior surgeon at Britain's Bridgewater Hospital, kept the wound open for 2 years. I have no words. It's definitely one of those things that doctors just leave at the back of their closet so they can forget it ever existed, like we ever did that. Who had the audacity to make this stuff up? Number 5. Shiro Ishii. No one likes to call this man a doctor, but alas, during World War II, that's kind of what he was. But there is one shocking detail that the government doesn't want to talk about. Shiro Ishii was called a genius time and time again. However, he used his brilliance to torment all POWs in Japanese prisoner of war camps. He worked for the Department of Biological Weapons in Unit 731 and performed inhumane experiments such as infecting prisoners with diseases like anthrax, inducing heart attacks, strokes, frostbite, you name it. His sick fascination resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, but here is the absolute worst part of it. He was never punished for his crimes. Instead, he avoided prosecution entirely because the US made a deal with him. If he gave up the results of his experiments, then he would be set free. Extort the suffering of thousands of people so you can have the knowledge of how to do that to thousands more. Definitely something no one likes to talk about. Number 4. Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was a pretty big deal, and to his credit was one of the first doctors to consider mental illness a disease, and it had nothing to do with demons. He was America's most well-known and trusted doctor and even signed the Declaration of Independence. He had some successes that laid the foundation for what doctors know today, but some of his methods are questionable. He believed that mental illness was due to bad circulation and swelling in the brain. So he would douse his patients in cold water in the winter, for example. He would twirl patients from ropes on the ceiling for hours on end to help circulation, but his most famous invention was the tranquilizer chair. The patient would be strapped to a chair, arms and legs, and their head would be covered by a wooden box. There was also a hole in the bottom for the patient's business, and they would be kept there for hours. Doesn't sound like the humane treatment everyone thought he did. A cruel case of trial and big time error. And coming up to number 3, the wandering womb. I love this one. The ancient Greeks thought the wombs of lonely, frustrated women broke free and wandered up the body, causing hysteria and pain. To remedy this, doctors recommended doing the deed, and that thoroughly helped. But this idea of a womb wandering also translated into explanations for pain in other areas. If a woman's shoulder hurt, for instance, it would be because the womb was stuck up there. Though this idea was abandoned long ago, the dismissal of pain has been an issue, especially to do with a medical condition of endometriosis. If a woman experiences pain or cramping in that area, it's usually dismissed as menstrual pain and is told not to worry. However, these symptoms are also clues for a more severe condition called endometriosis, which affects 1 in 10 US women between the ages of 15 and 44, but this might not be accurate. It takes the average woman 7.5 years to get a correct diagnosis of endometriosis, which means there could be more, with surgery being the most common form of confirmation. Even worse still, there is no cure. Of course, doctors experience thousands of patients, but is there an issue of pain dismissal when it comes to women when they report it? I think it's something worth talking about. Number 2, holding a spine. Now we're getting into the creepy freaking stories from real life nurses. As a medical practitioner, you see some incredibly crazy things. You realize the impossible is possible on a daily basis. I read this story by Angiotensin. Obviously someone had to talk about this story, but I can't imagine that this wouldn't be easy to recall. The story goes as follows, and I quote, "In my EMT class, an instructor was telling me about one of her calls to a freeway accident. There were 2 cars involved and one of them had an elderly couple in it. Since she was so small, my instructor is often assigned the job of crawling through the windows of the car to stabilize patients while the crew works on prying the doors open. She crawled into the back seat of the elderly couple's car and held a manual C-spine for the woman," which is like holding someone's head in place to prevent an injury by twisting the spinal cord. "As she held the head, it came off in her hands. The woman had been decapitated by the accident. She had to take a couple weeks off after that and talk to her therapist to help cope. Can't imagine what it must be like to go through something like that." Unquote. I'm kinda glad she caved and talked about it, because if she kept that stuff like bottled up, she might have lost her own head. Too soon. That was too soon. Number 1, dangerous confessions. Oftentimes doctors and nurses hear the confessions of dying patients, and under their code of ethics, if a patient doesn't give their consent, whatever they say can't be shared, even after they die. If it was, it would be a breach in confidentiality. But what if they confess to something big, like killing several people as a young man, as one elderly patient did? He was 70 years old with advanced cancer and confessed to taking on several contract killings, and that the bodies may not have been found. In this case, it's not that the doctors don't want to say anything, it's that they have to hold it back. The man also said that he spent the last 40 years trying to atone, and though he wouldn't allow the confession, he did write a letter to be given to police after his death. Yes, it is true that a doctor is allowed to breach confidentiality to prevent harm, but the crimes had happened so long ago, and in his state he was unlikely to commit anything like that again. So this case brought up a lot of questions involving what should and should not be permissible in these cases, but it does make you wonder what kinds of secrets some doctors have kept in honor of confidentiality. Secrets that they too will take to the grave. Number 10, don't let me die. The first story was from allnurses.com and recounts a terrifying encounter that sent chills down everyone's spine. Obviously, someone had to spill the tea in order for us to get the story, okay? I'm fully aware of the title and the hypocrisy of me telling stories with the things they refuse to talk about, but here we are. Okay? The story goes as follows. While treating a patient with a variety of illnesses, the nurses treating him realized the sad reality that he wasn't going to make it. However, the man was desperate to stay alive. Every time his heart monitor beeped, he would grab and scratch at the nurses to keep him alive and would scream, "Don't let me die," over and over and over again. Then, one night when the nurse was rushing in to address the calls, she saw the man floating above the bed 2 inches high. He was laughing, but not in a voice she recognized, and his face was contorted in a sick, dark smile. He laughed at the nurse and said, and I quote, "You stupid witches aren't going to let me die, are you?" Unquote. After that, he went into cardiac arrest and passed away 20 minutes later. 5 minutes after that, the patient apparently sat back up, started laughing, and a voice said, "You let him die, too bad." An agonizing scream then filled the hall, and the words, "Don't let me die," echoed through the unit. It wasn't until the morning the voices stopped. Nobody went anywhere by themselves after that. Number 9, the dancing plague. As preposterous as it sounds, the dancing plague was a real thing. Like, it actually happened. And it's so ridiculous, doctors prefer to leave it in the history books. Let's just not talk about that. In Strasbourg in July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophia kicked off in the middle of the square and started twisting and shouting repeatedly, kind of crazily. For about a week, she continued alone until 40 people joined her. Then that number shot up to 400 in the next month. Physicians were flummoxed, bamboozled, confused, dare I say. Though they at first encouraged it by bringing professional dancers in and a band. They thought it was due to the hot blood and depression that plagued the community. But then people started dancing so hard they died of strokes and heart attacks. What started out as a spontaneous jig transformed into a toxic tango. It sounds so fake, it really does. It sounds like something straight out of Hocus Pocus, like Bette Midler, where were you? But it is in fact a well-documented event. There are portraits There are paintings, it's insane. One explanation is ergo, a fungus found on rye that produces hallucinations and spasms. It could have infected the crops, causing widespread hysteria. That's one explanation, but we don't know. Number 8, putrid finger syndrome. Have you ever been so fed up with a Rubik's Cube like you never want to see or hear of one ever again? Yeah, that's how doctors must feel about unsolved cases. Or not. But, you know, maybe. But in any case, this story is absolutely crazy. If you're someone who hates smelling bad, well, this would be a nightmare. 5 years after a 29-year-old patient pricked his finger on a chicken bone, he developed an infection that made his arm smell like it was death itself, like literally just dying. It smelled so bad, the scent could fill a banquet hall. Doctors and nurses had to go in intervals to treat him because the smell was just so bad. Imagine being the patient. Oh god. No matter what treatments they gave him, doctors couldn't solve it. They didn't know what the bacteria was, but before it could be identified, the man made a miraculous recovery. The infection just cleared up all of a sudden. Perhaps something the doctors did helped it, but nothing could be confirmed, so he just went on his merry way with his arm back to normal. Number 7, boar bile enemas. Fair warning, we are entering the portion of this list where we talk about healthcare practices no one wants to talk about ever again because they were so horrendous. But today it's my job to remind you of the boar bile enema. While enemas are common practice today to flush out our number 2 issues, this one used a unique substance. Clysters were a medieval device, just like this, that doctors used to perform an enema. But instead of water, they used a concoction of boar bile. And if you don't know what a boar is a kind of like crazy pig. How they got the bile, we don't know. But hey, at least they kept things interesting. What evidence they had for the effectiveness of boar bile over just like plain water, we will never know. But nevertheless, this method was hugely popular for King Louis XIV of France, who had over 2,000 of these procedures administered over the course of his reign. Some even while he was sitting on his throne, and we're not talking about the toilet throne, we're talking about like his actual throne in the middle of everything. So if you ever dreamt of visiting Versailles back in its glory days, maybe reconsider the idea. Fun fact, oftentimes nobles would just like relieve themselves in the middle of the hall. So Versailles was like, Hall of Mirrors was not something you'd want to step into. Just saying. Number 6, a hot iron where? While heat has many medicinal uses, I think you will be horrified to learn where and how they used to use it. Yes, extreme heat can stop bleeding to help by cauterizing a wound, or a nice heat pad can ease muscles. But back in medieval times, people like to use like hot pokers to treat a lot of issues such as venereal diseases and hemorrhoids, meaning that they often administered searingly hot pokers to tender areas of the body in order to burn off ailments. Surprise! It wasn't very effective. However, the other option was also uncomfortable. You had to sit on a rock called St. Fiacrius' rock. Apparently, it cured a 17th century Irish monk's hemorrhoids. So, hot poker on your bottom, or you sit on a rock for an indefinite amount of time. Tough choice. Finally though, in the 12th century, a Jewish physician suggested a hot bath to help, and today we can be thankful for ointment. Number 5, medical astrology. What's your star sign? The dreaded first date question. When's your birthday? Astrology is one of those pseudoscientific but also weirdly accurate things that occupies our everyday TikTok FYPs, or at least mine. Ooh, I just revealed too much. But did you know that many doctors were not just considered miraculous because of their medical practices, but they'd often predict the weather, they could tell you what personality your child would have, and advised on crops. By the 1500s, doctors were legally required to assess a patient's horoscope before they did anything in terms of treatment of their medical issues. They would use astrological information to see how the sun, moon, and planets would affect the human body. After their star chart was taken into account, then a diagnosis and treatment plan could be made. In modern times, pseudoscience PhDs are very much a thing, which many aforementioned doctors don't like talking about, so make sure you do your research. Number 4. Speaking of which, the starvation doctor. And now we move on to the portion of the list where doctors have tainted the names of being a doctor, and can no longer claim to be any such thing. One such awful person was Linda Burfield Hazard. Just like the aforementioned pseudoscience practitioners, Linda wasn't a proper medical doctor. In fact, she earned her license through a loophole that allowed practitioners of alternative medicine into the field. By most accounts that I can find, she was a swindler, a crook, a quack, and her horrendous methods resulted in the death of 40 people. She wrote 2 books, one called Fasting or the Cure of Disease and Scientific Fasting, the Ancient and Modern Key to Health. She believed that all illnesses were a result of excessive eating and that you had to starve yourself for months to stave off disease. She created her own sanitarium where patients would fast for days, weeks, months, accompanied by massages that were more like beatings. All she allowed them to eat was tomato juice, asparagus juice, and a teaspoon of orange juice occasionally. No wonder she was called the starvation doctor. Even worse, in order to assert her power, she'd have her patients declared mentally insane if they wanted to leave. Eventually, she was convicted of manslaughter in 1912, thank goodness, sentenced to hard labor, but was pardoned 2 years later for unknown reasons, moved to New Zealand and tried to practice there, but there her license was revoked for lack of credentials. Way to go, New Zealand. Number 3, Vicki Dawn Jackson. Going to the doctor is scary enough, and so is leaving the ones you love in their care. Doctors are superhuman who put everything they have and more into caring about our lives. Who can say less after the past 2 years? So when people like Vicki Dawn Jackson existed, why would anyone want to talk about them? Jackson worked in a small town in North Texas as a nurse in the hospital there. She was described as sweet, kind, generous, hardworking, a dedicated nurse, and that she was, until something inside her snapped. Between December 2000 and February 2001, a series of respiratory deaths affected the elderly in addition to middle-aged patients in the hospital. No one suspected anything sinister until one of the other nurses discovered that their stock of mivacurium had significantly decreased. Mivacurium is a drug used to temporarily stop a patient's ability to breathe when they insert like the tube down your throat, which therefore implied more sinister events were occurring. Another nurse named Donna McIver noticed that every time an unruly patient would act out, she recalled that Vicki would say, "I'll take care of it," or "I'll fix it." She also knew all the victims and had some really negative relationships with some of them who had treated her poorly. No one could believe it was Vicki. She was the most caring nurse at the hospital, but little did they know that she was the angel of death. Number 2, Harold Shipman. Another man who taints the name of doctor. Shipman was an English doctor who should have never ever gotten his degree or a job in the first place. It just blows my mind that he did. He failed his entrance exam, which should have ended things there, but he somehow managed to actually earn a placement, and though he got into the profession for a noble cause to honor the death of his mother, he did the exact opposite in his career. He was fired from his first placement for forging prescriptions, another reason his career should have stopped. I think that's what bothers me the most about this case, is that there were so many ways 260 lives could have been saved. But no, another practice, Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde, took him in. If it weren't for the local undertaker and Angela Woodruff, he might have never been caught. He noticed that Shipman's patients were always found sitting or reclined on a couch or sofa. Then on top of that, Angela Woodruff's mother died, leaving behind a will giving everything to Shipman. Angela's mother had just been to see Shipman that day, highlighting an all too deadly pattern. Shipman was lethally injecting each patient before they left his office, giving them just enough time to pass away when they got home. Pure evil. And lastly, number 1, Walter Freeman. Did you know that the man who invented the lobotomy used an ice pick from his own kitchen? Lobotomies themselves, as well as shock therapy, sound like the kind of treatments only evil doctors would use, but strangely enough, they actually are still practiced today. Lobotomies, however, it's really rare, but ECT, it's used quite often. At one time, Freeman was revered across America as being the first man to perform a prefrontal lobotomy. He would use electroshock therapy, ECT, to knock the patient out, and then Freeman would go in there and literally remove part of their brain, blindly. This would often leave patients in a vegetative state, which was preferred by the doctors because the patients were not acting out. This dude was either power hungry or something, but considering the obvious fact that it didn't work, it didn't fix anything, and 490 90 people died, he just kept pushing it. He modified the procedure and traveled around in what he called his lobotomobile and demonstrated the procedure across the country. He even went on to perform this horrendous, poorly researched treatment on Rosemary Kennedy at age 23, who sadly fell into an incurable vegetative state. But I kind of feel like he got a little bit of karma when he performed the procedure in the media, and in one instance the patient died right before their eyes. After years of this utter mania, his license was finally revoked and he died of cancer when he was 76 or something like that. Yeah, no punishment at all for his just like horrendous procedure with no medical backing. Good for you, man.
In our number 9 spot today, we have this eyeless face story. Before I get into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. This one comes from a nurse rather than a doctor, but I feel like it definitely still applies. She was working at the home of an elderly lady who had some learning disabilities and had also had her eyes completely removed due to a condition that she had from birth. The lady was apparently super nice, but had this habit of wandering around her apartment late at night in complete silence. One night the nurse woke up and left her room at 2 a.m. to head to the bathroom when she had quite the scare. As she left her bedroom, she was met with the old lady who was silently standing in the hall as she turned her eyeless face towards the nurse. Imagine being in a dark room after you just woke up and seeing an eyeless face look at you. It honestly would be enough to frighten anyone before you realized exactly what was going on. In our number 8 spot today, we have another eye story. This story comes from someone who goes by the screen name I'm Cuttin, and they said, "I have quite a few stories. Most of them are hilarious, and then there are those you never want to think about. What messed me up the most was when I saw how eyes change at the moment of death. Imagine you are looking at clear water, but that clear water changes to foggy in an instant. In my 8 years here, I've only seen this once, and I've personally seen well over 250 dead or dying people." This is one thing that I've always thought that I can't understand how healthcare professionals do. I definitely don't think I can see people die all the time, especially not when it's like what he just described. In our number 7 spot today, we have a car accident story. This story comes from a person called Jeremy Howell, and they're recounting one of their mom's stories. Jeremy says, "A guy came in from a car accident and was losing blood. In the midst of resuscitation, the man jolts awake and screams, 'Don't let me go back there. Please, please, please don't let me go back.' A few seconds later, they lost him." What? Like, imagine. That would scare me half to death. Seriously, you guys. In our number 6 spot today, we have this dead guy moaning story. This story comes from someone who goes by the username I'll Do It Later from when they worked at a hospital. They said, "One of my duties was to help wheel patients who had expired down to the in-house morgue. Once we were wheeling an older man from the ER down the hallway when he let out this low moan. I started to panic thinking that he was coming back to life, but the registered nurse explained to me, in brackets they have newbie, that sometimes the air in the lungs doesn't come out until sometime later, or it is delayed for a bit." While I definitely feel like whoever this story is from should have definitely already known this, that would be so scary for a second when you don't know what is happening. In our number 5 spot today, we have a crying blood story. This is another story that comes from a registered nurse, but it definitely needed to be mentioned in this video. A 24-year-old man came into the ER one day with flu-like symptoms. He had some sort of rash that sadly ended up being a symptom of failing a battle with bacterial meningitis, and it was causing him to bleed internally. He was in such bad condition that he started crying, but his tears were blood. She said she could see how scared he was at his eyes, which is so sad to think about. He ended up actually passing away, and the nurse whose story this is had said that in her long nursing career, this is the one that just really stuck with her. In our number 4 spot today, we have a whole story. This story comes from someone called Pete Lancosta and is a bit of a gross one, so just a warning. Pete says it was someone who had a massive hole under his right arm, creating a cavity where you could see and hear whistling from the right lung. It had been worsening for maybe 10 years, so the initial injury had mostly healed. Honestly, you guys, I almost couldn't read this one out loud. I can't imagine what that would be like for all parties involved in that situation. And number 3 spot today, we have a tumor story. This story actually ended up being published in a medical journal for how crazy it is. A 90-pound, 16-year-old girl came in one day with flu-like symptoms, a sore right side with a bit of a bump. They went to check for gallstones, but it actually turned out to be a tumor. It ended up being removed the next week, and it turned out to be a 7-pound tumor that was as big as a dinner plate. This is not normal. It was so big that it had outgrown its blood supply. That's insane and so yucky. I'm glad this one came out with such a positive outcome though. We needed more of that on this list today. In our number 2 spot today, we have this intestine story. This story starts off on a wild note from someone who is explaining one of their mom's stories. It goes, apparently one guy walked into the emergency room entrance holding his intestines in his hand, calm as can be, and shouted, "Can I get a little help, please? I think I'm gonna die." Now, this dude wasn't gutted wide open holding all of his entrails, but he had a pretty major cut to the midsection, causing some of his intestines to be protruding externally. This dude is alive, and my mom told me she had no idea how somebody could walk into an emergency room like that and be so calm. Honestly, props to everyone in this situation for remaining calm, because it undoubtedly saved that guy's life that day. In our number 1 spot today, you guys, we have this rising from the dead story. This story comes from someone who goes by Simple Simon 6262 and is honestly pretty crazy, but also kind of cool. They said, "When I was a student, I got called in on a stroke patient. She had coded and they were doing CPR. They worked for 45 minutes, but she died. They cleaned her up and called on the family to say goodbye, but by that time, the family had left. She had been both brain dead and without a pulse for more than 45 minutes. Suddenly, she sat up and called for her family. The nurses rushed to get the monitors and equipment back on her. They started working on her again, she stabilized, said goodbye to her family, and then promptly died a second time." That would be so insane to witness, but I'm also so glad that she got to say goodbye to her family. I honestly think that must be the reason she ended up coming back, even if it was just for a couple minutes.